Our next guest is Dr. Tom Lewis OAM. He's combined careers as an author, a military historian, a high school teacher, and a military officer. He served as an intelligence analyst for nearly 20 years in the Australian Defence Forces. He saw service in Baghdad, Iraq, and in East Timor. Tom is the author or co-author of 17 books. His Order of Australia Medal was awarded for services to naval history. Tom, great to see you. How are you, mate?
Morning, Rowan. Good.
Great to have you here. Now, listen, 75 years ago, they dropped the big one, well, on August 6th on Hiroshima, then on August 9th today on Nagasaki. You argue in The Spectator this week that rather than this being a dreadful thing, it was actually a really good thing. Explain why.
Well, it certainly was a good thing, although it's hard to say that with what happened with the two 8-bomb drops. If the war had continued through to the end of, say, 1946, we would have seen probably 30 million Japanese dying and probably 1.5 million of our people dying. So rather than continue, the two A-bombs brought the war to a sudden close.
So how do you arrive at those figures, Tom, about the deaths that would have occurred? Obviously, the 200,000 deaths at Nagasaki and Hiroshima were dreadful, a horrible tragedy. But how do you arrive at the figures that would have been so much worse had those bombs not been dropped? That's hypothetical, isn't it?
Sure, but by careful calculation, two of the chapters at the end of the book calculate the Allied deaths and the Japanese deaths. And some of those figures are a bit easier than others, if you can put it that way. For example, 300,000 POWs, the order had gone out to execute them. So there's 300,000 for you. If you look at, say, the Japanese forces, 6 million people under arms. So the Japanese fought in World War II like you wouldn't believe. 97% of their forces died rather than surrender. So if you look at 97% of 6 million, you can add that to the equation. And so it goes. So, for example, every month the war went on, you found 250,000 people dying a week in Japanese-held territories. These figures are sort of amazing and difficult to comprehend after the war's been over for nearly 80 years. But if you do those calculations, that's where you end up. The Japanese also had conscripted into their militia, so a quasi-military force, most of their population of 71 million. So you're looking at the people over 13 signing up, well, being forced to fight in the military with primitive weapons, so satchel charges, an explosive in a satchel, you hurl yourself under a tank, a musket, so it's a single-shot weapon from the 18th century, a pipe, which is a spear. All of these people would have been conscripted or were being conscripted and trained to fight. So do the numbers and you end up with these appalling totals.
Now, Tom, your book, Atomic Salvation, I will stick up the cover in a second, fascinating reading. One of the things that absolutely intrigues me just about the mentality of wartime, the Japanese Empire, you refer to the Saipan Ratio. Explain what that is.
It's a term that was coined during the war, and it basically shows that 97% of a Japanese force would die in combat rather than surrender. This is amazing. The British General Slim said most armies talk about fighting to the end, and in my experience they don't, but the Japanese do. And so your life belongs to the Emperor. So rather than surrender, you fight until you're dead. So 97% of their force dies. With a conventional military force, basically it's 30%. So if 3 out of 10 are on the ground, 2 wounded and 1 dead perhaps, your morale breaks. The morale is very important in an armed force. And you run. You throw down your weapons and run away. With the Japanese in World War II, it's completely different. They fight until they die, and 97% of them would have died. So an armed force of 6 million, 97% would have died. The Saipan Ratio term comes from the island Saipan. So in Peleliu, Okinawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, 97% die. And that's how they fought.
Rita.
I'm interested in your take about the rewriting of history. I've seen some commentary this week from Boston Review and a few others blaming racism for the bomb and saying that it should have never been dropped, and it was only dropped because the victims weren't going to be white. Can you just tell us about the ignorance behind those sort of statements and a little bit about the Japanese aggression during the war?
Well, the Japanese aggression was a terrible thing, attacking China and making their empire. I'm sitting in Darwin, where we were bombed very heavily from the 19th of February onwards, and we suffered 208 air missions across northern Australia. So that's how the Japanese fought. They were very, very aggressive, and they went after an empire, and they got it, and then they were determined to hold on to it. I don't think it's a racist thing at all. Basically, they were the enemy, and unconditional surrender was what we demanded. We saw what conditional surrender did with Germany after World War I. It basically started to create World War II. So the unconditional surrender was what we demanded. There were going to be no terms. Strangely enough, the Japanese decided in their high command that conditional surrender was something they could get. If we invaded their islands, taking the west end first and then advancing up towards Tokyo, they thought that they could inflict such damage on us that we would eventually decide that, OK, conditional surrender is something we can work with. And if you go to Japan, and I've been to Japan many times, it's a wonderful place, 75% of it is not level. So fighting up through Japan would have inflicted tremendous damage on us. And eventually we would have said, well, look, this is pretty bad. What do you really want? And by expending millions of their people, they would have got what they wanted, conditional surrender.
Just very quickly before we go, Tom, I just wanted to ask your thoughts on the submarines deal that the Turnbull government struck. Billions of dollars on submarines due whenever. What's your thoughts? You're an expert.
Oh, Rowan, you know I've written in The Spectator a couple of times about this. Absolute disaster. Would you buy a car like this? Would you walk into a showroom and say, I'll have 12 of those, please, but I want you to take out the electric engine and put in a diesel one instead? It's a disaster. These submarines are going to have to be cancelled sooner or later. And look, let's save money. We need it.
Thank you so much, Tom Lewis, and you can buy his book, Atomic Salvation. Thanks for coming on, Tom. Great to see you, mate.